In January of 1962, in a secondary school staff room in a market town somewhere in the middle of England, a woman in a fitted skirt and court shoes told the headmaster she was engaged to be married. He congratulated her, and within the same sentence the conversation moved to the question of who would replace her. She had not yet left the room. She was not being dismissed. She was not being punished. She had, by every measure, done nothing wrong. She was a good teacher, employed for 7 years, respected by her colleagues, and trusted with the education of the children of other people. But the act of accepting a ring from the man she intended to marry had activated a set of legal and institutional consequences that neither the ring nor the man had anything to do with. Her career, her financial independence, her pension, and, in ways she did not yet fully understand, her legal autonomy over her own body, her own savings, and eventually her own children, were about to change, not because of something she had done, because of what British law, in 1962, believed marriage required a woman to become. What did a typed resignation letter look like when it ended not a failure but a career? What happened to a pension when the woman who had earned it was told to stop working? What was the actual legal status of the money in the kitchen drawer of a married woman? What did a woman do when her marriage was finished but the law required her to prove a crime before she could leave? What was the hotel evidence system, and how did a woman arrange for a stranger to pretend to sleep with her husband in a seaside hotel in order to satisfy a judge? What did it mean that the savings from the housekeeping allowance, accumulated over years of careful arithmetic, belonged in law to the man who had given her the money in the first place? And what did it cost, not in principle, but in specific, documented, measurable terms, to have been born a woman in Britain at exactly the wrong moment in the 20th century? This is the story of the decade that is remembered as the Age of Liberation, the 1960s, the contraceptive pill, the miniskirt, the Cultural Revolution. But beneath that story, there is another one, the story of the women who lived through those years inside a legal architecture that had not yet caught up with the freedoms the newspapers celebrated, and who navigated day by day the distance between the world they were told they now inhabited and the world they actually lived in. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy it. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. The resignation letter was typed on cream paper with a carbon copy beneath it. The paper had a particular weight to it, slightly heavier than standard typing paper, the kind used for formal correspondence in schools and government offices. The carbon copy, thin and blue, black, was the duplicate that smudged if handled with damp fingers, and it sat beneath the original in the precise alignment that a careful typist maintained. The letter itself was a short document, 3 paragraphs at most, expressing gratitude for the years of employment, noting the reason for departure, and acknowledging the marriage gratuity that would be paid in lieu of continued pension contributions. The carbon copy went into a kitchen drawer. The original went to the headmaster. The headmaster placed it in a file alongside, in all likelihood, several others from previous years, and the career of a woman who had done nothing wrong was by the end of the afternoon a matter of administration. The staff room in which this exchange took place was a room she knew well. 7 years of tea and conversation, and the particular smell of institutional heating and old paper. She had arrived each morning in the professional uniform of a woman in office or teaching employment in the early 1960s, a fitted skirt to the knee, court shoes, a blouse with a collar, hair set and sprayed. The requirements of this professional appearance consumed time and money. She had dressed for this room and worked in it and been valued in it. And the morning she announced her engagement was the morning the room began the process of forgetting her. The congratulations from the head teacher were genuine. The conversation about her replacement was also genuine. Both could be true simultaneously. The system was not malicious. It was mechanical. The marriage gratuity was a lump, some payment offered by certain public sector employers to women who resigned upon marriage. It was presented as a benefit, a financial recognition of years of service, a wedding gift of sorts from the institution. In practice, it functioned as a mechanism for severing the pension entitlement of a woman at the precise moment she entered a legal relationship that would make independent financial provision nearly impossible. The gratuity was a one-time payment. It arrived in a single sum, was spent or saved within months, and was gone. The pension it replaced would have accumulated for the rest of her working life. It would have compounded. It would have been there at 60 or 65, when the need for it is greatest. A woman who accepted the gratuity at the age of 29 and did not return to the workforce until her children were grown would find, decades later, that the gap in her national insurance contributions had produced a gap in her retirement income that no subsequent employment could fully close. The gratuity was a handshake. The pension was a future. The exchange between them was not equal. The typed letter confirming her resignation was itself a specific kind of document. One page, a reference to the marriage gratuity amount, and a closing wish for her future happiness. This was the physical form of a marriage, a bar departure. The woman typed it herself in many cases on the same typewriter she had used for lesson plans and term reports. She handed it to a line manager who had probably expected it. The carbon copy, blue, black, slightly smudged, was the only record she took with her. The original went into a filing cabinet that would be opened again only if someone needed to confirm the dates of her employment, for a reference she might never be asked for. The marriage bar itself, the formal requirement that women resign from employment upon marriage, had been officially abolished in the Home Civil Service in October of 1946. The teaching profession had formally ended the practice with the Education Act of 1944. Nursing had followed a similar path, but formal abolition and cultural expectation are not the same thing. Throughout the 1950s and into the early years of the 1960s, many women resigned upon marriage without any legal compulsion, because the social infrastructure for combining marriage and employment, adequate childcare, flexible working arrangements, and the simple social acceptance of a married woman holding a job did not exist. The law said she could stay. The world around her said she should not. Her mother had not stayed. Her neighbours had not stayed. The women whose opinions mattered to her had not stayed, and so she did not stay either, even when no one required her to go. And in the Foreign Office the bar had not been abolished at all. Throughout the entire decade of the 1960s, a woman who joined the diplomatic service of the United Kingdom was formally required to choose between a career representing her country abroad and the act of marrying. The Foreign Office maintained this restriction until 1973. A woman who entered the service in 1960 at the age of 22 would have faced the prospect of 12 years of required singleness as a condition of professional advancement. The law did not prevent her from loving someone. It prevented her from marrying them and continuing to work. The choice was explicit, documented, and enforced. It was not a consequence of culture or tradition. It was written into the terms of employment. The world she entered on her wedding day was not, in the physical sense, unfamiliar. It was the same town, the same streets, the same house she had probably visited many times before the ring. but the legal landscape behind those familiar walls had shifted in ways that were invisible from the street. The wedding itself had been a modest affair. A Saturday morning at the parish church, a reception at the church hall, sandwiches and cake prepared by her mother and her aunts. The wedding dress had been made by a local dressmaker, fitted over several visits in a front room that smelled of fabric and pins and the particular dry warmth of an electric fire. The dress would be wrapped in tissue paper and stored in a trunk, where it would remain for decades, gradually yellowing, a garment she would never wear again, but that marked the precise moment at which her legal identity changed. Because it was her legal identity that changed, not merely her social status. Upon marriage, she acquired the name of her husband, his domicile, and, in ways that the marriage ceremony did not mention, his legal authority over significant aspects of her daily life. The assumption of the surname of the husband was not a legal requirement, but it was a social expectation so universal that a woman who retained her maiden name would have been regarded at best as eccentric. The name change rippled through every document: her identity card, her bank book if she had one, her library card, her insurance records. The woman she had been before the wedding, the teacher, the professional, the earner, was administratively replaced by the wife, identified primarily by her relationship to the man she had married. In the early 1960s, only approximately 5% of British homes had central heating. The vast majority of families relied on a single coal fire in the main living room, and the rest of the house remained unheated. In winter, it was common to wake in the morning and find frost on the inside of the bedroom window, a thin layer of ice that formed where the warm breath of sleeping bodies met the cold glass of a room with no heat source. The bedroom in which a woman lay awake in the early hours of a January morning, calculating whether she could afford a solicitor or whether the housekeeping money would stretch to the end of the week, was the coldest room in the house. The first task of the day, before the kettle, before the breakfast, before any member of the family had dressed, was to clear the cold ash from the fire from the previous day, relay it with fresh coal, and coax it back to life. The coal itself had a specific presence in the household. A coal merchant delivered it at intervals, tipping dusty black fuel into the bunker in the back garden, leaving a fine black dust on the concrete path and on the hands of the woman who managed the delivery when the husband was at work. The smell of coal smoke from the chimney had a specific acrid quality that settled on curtains and upholstery and required regular airing, a background smell that was so constant it became invisible to the people who lived inside it, noticeable only to visitors and to the women who spent their mornings removing its traces from fabric. The house was not merely a place to live. It was an economic unit that required constant daily management. A male manual worker in the early 1960s earned, on average, approximately £14 per week, rising to around £22 by 1968. A woman in an equivalent manual role, if she was working at all, earned roughly £7 to £11 per week, approximately half the male rate. The household budget was calculated in shillings and pence, in the pre-decimal currency that would not be replaced until 1971. A large white loaf of bread cost between 1 shilling and 3p and 1 shilling and 7p. A pint of pasteurised milk cost approximately 9p to 10p halfpenny. A pound of butter cost around 3 shillings and 4p. Tea was approximately 6 shillings and 2p per pound. Rent for a working-class family rarely exceeded £2 per week. These were the specific numbers that defined the daily arithmetic, the particular mathematics of survival that a woman managing a household budget had to calculate every day, in pencil, in a notebook, at the kitchen table. Food accounted for approximately 30 3% of average household spending in Britain in the mid-1960s, a proportion twice what it represents today. This was not a statistical abstraction. It meant that the management of the food budget alone consumed a third of the household income, and that every decision about what to buy, what to make, and how to stretch it was a decision with immediate and measurable financial consequences. The Sunday meat was roasted on Sunday, served cold on Monday, minced into a shepherd pie by Wednesday, and rendered into a broth by Thursday. This was not poverty in the way that word is usually understood. It was the standard domestic practice of a generation that had been raised in wartime austerity and had carried its habits, along with its recipes, into peacetime. The skill of making food last was not optional. It was the daily economics of the household performed by the woman who ran it, without payment, without recognition, and without the legal right to claim the savings that her skill produced. And the money with which these calculations were made occupied a peculiar legal position. Under the precedent established by the 1943 court case Blackwell versus Blackwell, any savings that a wife accumulated from a housekeeping allowance provided by her husband were considered in law to be the property of the husband. The money she had saved by stretching meals, by mending clothes instead of replacing them, by walking instead of taking the bus, by collecting co-op dividend stamps and Green Shield stamps in a kitchen drawer and redeeming them for household goods, that money was legally his. She was, in the precise terms of British law, saving his money for him. The fact that the savings existed only because of her labour, her ingenuity, and her daily management of the household economy was, in the eyes of the court, irrelevant. The law looked at the source of the money, not at the labour that had preserved it. And the source was the husband. She kept these figures in a notebook, pencil entries in columns, shillings on the left, pence on the right. The pages accumulated over weeks and months, recording the specific cost of bread, of coal, of shoes for the children, of the television rental that required the name of her husband on the agreement, a hire purchase book, a small stamped ledger in which weekly payments for goods like a vacuum cleaner or a television were recorded, was another common domestic document that carried the name of the husband. This notebook was her daily work product, the evidence of the most constant, most demanding, and most invisible labour she performed, and for the first 2 years of her marriage, every pound recorded in it belonged in law to someone else. In the sitting room, the television produced its particular quality of light, a warm humming flicker of black and white that dominated the evenings, a screen with visible grain that was the primary source of entertainment and information for a family whose social world was bounded by the front door and the back garden. The set itself cost approximately £70 in the early 1960s, a substantial enough sum that many families chose to rent one for a few shillings a week rather than purchase it outright. The rental agreement, like the hire purchase book, like the mortgage application, like the bank account itself, typically required the name of the husband. Not because a specific statute demanded it, but because the banking and financial institutions of Britain operated under an unwritten assumption of what they called marital authority, the belief that the husband was the head of the household and the sole legitimate financial actor within it. A woman who wished to open a bank account in her own name could in practice find herself asked for the signature of a husband or co-signature. A woman who applied for credit or a mortgage would find that lenders routinely disregarded her income entirely or accepted only a fraction of it, sometimes as little as 1/3, on the grounds that she would eventually become pregnant and leave the workforce, rendering her earnings unreliable. The assumption was not tested. It was simply applied uniformly to every woman who walked through the door of every bank and building society in the country. A married woman who earned a regular wage, who had never missed a payment, and who managed a household budget with a level of financial discipline that would have impressed any assessor, could be refused credit because the system had already decided what she was going to do with her life. This was not, strictly speaking, the law. No statute said a woman could not open a bank account, but the institutional practice was so consistent, so universal, and so deeply embedded in the assumptions of the people who ran the institutions that it functioned, for the women who encountered it, as law. The distinction between what was legal and what was possible was, for a married woman in 1962, largely theoretical. It would not be until the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 that it became formally illegal for banks and lenders to discriminate against women in the provision of financial services. Throughout the entire decade of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the financial independence of a married woman was not a right protected by statute. It was a courtesy extended, or not, by individual men in individual offices, and the woman who was refused had no legal remedy, no ombudsman, no appeal. She went home, and beneath all of these restrictions, the marriage bar, the financial dependence, the institutional invisibility, lay a legal fact that the woman who resigned in January of 1962 almost certainly did not know, and that no one in the staff room that morning would have mentioned. Under the common law of England and Wales, as established by the 17th century jurist Sir Matthew Hale, a wife was held to have given irrevocable consent to sexual intercourse with her husband by the act of marriage itself. This principle was not a relic. It was not a historical curiosity preserved in textbooks and debated by scholars. It was the active, enforceable law of the land. The courts of England and Wales upheld this doctrine until 1991. In 1962, the marriage certificate that activated the resignation letter also activated, in legal terms, the permanent and irrevocable consent of the body of the woman to her husband. She signed one document. It activated another that she had never been shown. She put the carbon copy of the resignation letter in the kitchen drawer, beneath the housekeeping notebook and the marriage certificate and the television rental agreement. She kept it because she was careful with paperwork. She did not yet know that the document in the drawer was the last record of the career she would not return to for 9 years, or that the kitchen in which she placed it would become, for the better part of a decade, the only workplace in which her labour was performed, measured, and never paid. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house during cooking hours. In a home where only 5% of the country enjoyed central heating, the stove became the secondary heat source, and the room in which it operated became the centre of the domestic day. It was here that the housekeeping notebook was kept, the budget calculated, the meals planned in the particular vocabulary of post, war thrift. Here, too, that the children came home from school in the afternoon to something simple. Bread and dripping, toast, a boiled egg, prepared in a kitchen whose fire had been relit since morning. The back garden, visible through the kitchen window, held a concrete path, a coal bunker, and a washing line strung between 2 poles. This was the physical infrastructure of the domestic world, functional, unchanging, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who did not live inside it. Monday was wash day. The routine was so established, so deeply embedded in the rhythm of the week, that the smell of strong laundry soap and the sound of boiling water were consistent features of working. Class streets on a Monday morning. The Burco boiler, an electric or gas, heated copper unit, was filled and set to heat large quantities of water for boiling whites, a task essential for keeping clothes clean before modern detergents became standard. The mangle, a hand-cranked device for squeezing water from heavy wet fabric, produced a rhythmic creaking sound as it was turned, and the wet clothing emerged flattened and cold on the far side, ready to be hung on the washing line in the back garden, where the first cold air after the steam of the scullery hit the face of the woman, and the concrete path lay cold and damp beneath her shoes. The air in the kitchen or scullery on wash day was thick with the smell of strong soap, alkaline, slightly bleaching, clinging to the hands for hours afterward, and the grey, white light of steam that came through small windows and made the room feel smaller and hotter than it was. Many households in the early 1960s still relied on the older manual tools, the washboard, the wooden laundry tongs, the galvanized metal dolly tub, and the transition to mechanical washing was gradual, uneven, and far from complete. Monday was the hardest physical day of the week. Many women described it as such. The men who lived in the houses where it was performed did not describe it at all. The labour did not end when the laundry was hung. It continued through the pressing, heavy irons, shirts starched stiff, the specific physical effort of pushing hot metal across damp cotton until the fabric was smooth. The ironing board stood in the kitchen or the sitting room, depending on the house, and the work was done standing for hours in a room that was either too hot from the stove or too cold from the absence of heating. The stiff, starched feel of a freshly ironed shirt was the product of sustained manual effort, and the shirts were stacked in drawers that the husband opened without comment, because the labour that produced the result was, by its nature, invisible. The skill required to manage the clothing of a household, to mend, to patch, to stretch the life of a garment until it could stretch no further, was considerable. It was also unpaid, unrecognised, and, in the vocabulary of the time, not considered work. The kettle whistled throughout the day. Tea was the punctuation of domestic time, made and served multiple times between morning and evening, marking the divisions of the working day in a household where the concept of a break was theoretical. Tea was served at the first moment of the morning and at every transition thereafter, after the fire was relaid, after the shopping, after the children came home, in the brief interval before the evening meal, and again in the silence after the children had been put to bed and before the husband returned or retired. It was the constant of the nation, its daily sacrament, and the whistle of the kettle was the most consistent sound in the domestic day. The BBC Home Service played in the background of the kitchen, the voices of news presenters, a morning programme, the rhythm of the broadcast day providing a connection to the world outside the house that the woman herself rarely entered between the school run and the sound of the key in the front door. The radio brought news of a country that was changing, reports from Parliament, discussions about new legislation, the voices of women like Barbara Castle and Edith Summerskill whose names appeared in the papers. The woman in the kitchen heard these voices while she worked. She knew the world was changing. The question was whether it would change in time for her. Between the kettle and the coal fire settling in the grate with its soft shift and faint hiss, the house had its own acoustic signature, its own rhythm, its own way of telling a woman where she was in the day without looking at the clock. The silence of the house after the children had been put to bed and before the husband returned was a particular kind of silence, an hour in which the domestic day was technically complete, but the personal day had not begun. It was in this hour, under the small warm reading light above the bed, that a woman might read or think or lie awake considering the calculations that never quite balanced, not the arithmetic of the household budget, but the arithmetic of the life she was living versus the life she had expected. The afternoon light came through the net curtains of the sitting room, filtered, slightly yellowed, the particular quality of domestic daylight in Britain in winter. The net curtains themselves were a specific object of the domestic world. White or cream hung at every front window on the street, filtering the outside world into a diffuse and gentle light, while preventing the outside world from seeing in. They were a boundary. They were also a uniform. Every house on the terrace had them. Every woman on the street washed them. At 5:30, the sound of a key in the front door reorganized the entire structure of the afternoon. The husband was home. The house, which had been a workplace all day, became something else. A performance of domestic order, a presentation of the managed life, a set of surfaces that were clean, and a table that was laid, and a woman who was expected to be presentable after a full day of labour. The magazines for women of the early decade, publications like Woman and Good Housekeeping, reinforced this expectation in ways that were prescriptive without being explicit. Look fresh, look groomed, be ready, let him rest, ask about his day. The specific weight of the domestic wardrobe of a woman told this story. An apron over her house dress in the morning, a change of clothes before the husband returned, the effort of maintaining the division between working domestic and presentable wife. These were not laws, but they were rules, and their enforcement was social rather than legal, which made them in some ways harder to challenge than a statute. And there was a further fact, less visible but equally consequential. In the early 1960s, married women who sought paid employment outside the home sometimes discovered their own income was counted against them when calculating eligibility for certain state benefits. The system assumed that the income of a husband covered the household regardless of the actual circumstances of the marriage, regardless of whether the husband was present, accessible, or willing to share what he earned. A woman could be working, earning, and contributing, and find that her contribution made her worse off in the eyes of the state rather than better. The welfare system had been designed around the assumption of the male breadwinner, and the woman who did not fit that assumption found herself punished for the deviation. The school run at 8:45 in the morning was the window in which a housewife was visible in public, walking with children, exchanging brief words with other women at the school gate, participating for a few minutes in the life of the street before returning to a house that the world would not enter again until late afternoon. These brief exchanges were not trivial. They were, for many women, the primary form of adult social contact available during the working day. The conversation at the school gate, about children, about prices, about the weather, was also, in its way, a form of mutual surveillance. Women noticed when another woman looked tired or thinner or quieter than usual. They noticed, and they did not always ask. The social conventions of the time made it difficult to ask directly about the interior of the marriage of another woman, even when the evidence was visible on her face. Between 9 and 5 the day belonged to the house, and the house, in its cold rooms and its careful arithmetic, belonged to her, in practice, if not in law. The reading light above the bed at night, a small warm lamp, offered one of the only hours of genuinely private time in the structure of the domestic day. She might read, she might think, she might calculate again the numbers that would not balance. In 1963, the American writer Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminine Mystique. She had surveyed her former classmates from Smith College, educated, middle-class women who had achieved the domestic ideal of marriage, children, and a comfortable home, and found them profoundly unhappy. They described a sense of emptiness, a purposelessness, an inability to name what was wrong with their lives. Friedan gave their condition a phrase that entered the language immediately. She called it the problem that has no name. The book sold more than 1 million copies in its first year. It resonated with women across the Atlantic who recognized themselves in its pages. British women who had resigned from jobs, who managed households, who raised children, and who felt, without being able to articulate it, that the life they had been told was the pinnacle of female achievement was also, in some specific and measurable way, the ceiling of their intellectual existence. But Friedan was naming something that British women already lived. The problem was not merely psychological. It was legal, economic, and structural. The woman who managed the household budget with a pencil and a notebook was performing a form of labour that accounted for the management of roughly 1/3 of the household income, yet she was not paid, was not credited, and, until 1964, could not even legally claim the savings her own work had produced. The Married Women Property Act of 1964 changed this. Introduced by the Labour politician Edith Summerskill, after a campaign that had lasted 21 years, the Act established that money derived from a housekeeping allowance, and any property acquired with it, should be treated as belonging to the husband and the wife in equal shares. The case of Blackwell versus Blackwell was overturned in statute. The money in the kitchen drawer was no longer, in law, his money that she was saving for him. It was, at last, partly hers. 21 years. Summerskill had begun campaigning for this provision before the end of the Second World War. She'd argued the case in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords, in public meetings, in the press. The principle she had fought for, that a woman who saved money through her own labour should own what she had saved, was so straightforward, so manifestly reasonable, that the fact it required 2 decades of sustained political action to achieve it tells the listener something about the distance between what was obviously right and what the law was willing to concede. But the 1964 Act had a specific, important limitation. It addressed only housekeeping savings. It did not establish the automatic right of a wife to a share of the matrimonial home. A married woman whose husband owned the house, whose name was the only name on the deeds, could legally be left with nothing upon the death of the husband or the breakdown of the marriage. The money in the drawer was now half hers. The house in which the drawer stood was not. The psychological weight of this limitation was not abstract. A woman who had managed a household for a decade, who had stretched every pound, mended every garment, negotiated every bill, understood, with a clarity that required no legal education, that the house she had maintained was not hers. The deeds were in his name. The mortgage was in his name. The building society that had approved the loan had not considered her income, had not consulted her, had not asked whether she intended to spend the next 20 years maintaining a property to which she had no legal claim. She cleaned windows that belonged to someone else. She painted walls that belonged to someone else. She planted flowers in a garden that, if the marriage ended, she could be asked to leave. The 1964 Act had given her half the money in the drawer. It had not given her the drawer. She wrote the accounts for the week in the notebook. The column of figures balanced. She closed it. It was her best work of the week, and it would never be paid. The expertise required to manage a household on £14 a week was real, measurable, and entirely unrecognised by any formal system of valuation. A woman who could stretch a Sunday joint across 4 meals, who could calculate the cost of coal against the falling temperature, and decide which rooms to heat and which to leave cold, who could mend a school uniform so that the repair was invisible, Who could keep 3 children clothed and fed and presentable on a budget that left no margin for error? This woman was performing a role that, in any commercial context, would have been called management. She was a procurement officer, a financial controller, a logistics coordinator, and a facilities manager. She held none of these titles. She held the title of wife, and the title carried no salary, no pension, no employment record, and no legal claim to the assets her labour maintained. The cultural reinforcement of this arrangement was constant and pervasive. Magazines for women published in the period, Woman, Woman Own, Good Housekeeping, presented domestic perfection as the natural aspiration of every married woman. The advertisements that funded these publications showed gleaming kitchens, spotless laundry, and smiling wives presenting meals to appreciative husbands. The message was not ambiguous. This was what the life of a woman was supposed to look like. The women who read these magazines, and millions did, were simultaneously performing the labour the magazines celebrated and consuming the propaganda that told them the labour was a privilege. The disconnect between the effort required and the recognition received was total. The magazines told her she should be grateful. The housekeeping notebook told her she should be paid. The woman who had resigned in 1962 read these magazines. She read them at the kitchen table between meals in the narrow windows of time that the domestic schedule permitted. She read articles about how to remove stains from cotton, how to prepare a dinner party on a budget, how to keep a husband interested, how to discipline children without raising her voice. She read the problem pages, where women wrote anonymous letters describing lives that sounded remarkably like her own. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the feeling that something essential had been lost when the staff room door closed behind her for the last time. She recognized these women. She was these women. And the advice the magazines offered, try harder, be more organized, find a hobby, talk to your husband, was the advice of a system that had created the problem and was now offering to manage its symptoms. The problem pages were, in their way, the most revealing documents of the decade. They were the place where the private reality of domestic life leaked into print, anonymized, cautious, stripped of identifying detail, but unmistakable in their content. Women wrote about feeling invisible. They wrote about husbands who did not speak to them except to ask what was for dinner. They wrote about the terror of another pregnancy when the household budget could not stretch to another child. They wrote about the morning routine, the fire, the breakfast, the school run, the shopping, the cleaning, the cooking, the evening meal, the clearing up, the ironing, the preparation for tomorrow, and the way that routine, repeated without variation for years, had produced a numbness that they could not name and did not know how to cure. The editors who answered these letters did so with kindness and practicality. They suggested evening classes or a conversation with a vicar or a visit to the doctor. They did not suggest that the structure itself was the problem. They could not. The magazine that printed the problem page was funded by the advertisements that sold the products that sustained the structure. The system was circular, and the woman at its centre turned with it. But the notebook, the budget, the careful arithmetic of bread and coal and rent, these were the visible structure of confinement. Beneath them lay a deeper architecture, one that governed not what a woman could spend, but what she could decide about her own body. And this architecture, in the early 1960s, was older, more rigid, and more resistant to reform than anything written in a housekeeping ledger On the 4th of December, 1961, the Minister of Health, Enoch Powell, stood in the House of Commons and confirmed that the contraceptive pill could be prescribed through the National Health Service. The announcement was brief. The implications were enormous. For the first time in the history of medicine, a reliable, woman-controlled method of preventing pregnancy was theoretically available to any woman in Britain who visited her general practitioner and asked for it. Theoretically. The gap between the announcement and the reality was, for many women, wide enough to walk through and emerge on the other side unchanged. In practice, access to the pill in the early 1960s depended almost entirely on the personal views of the individual doctor. Many general practitioners declined to prescribe it to unmarried women on moral grounds. Others declined to prescribe it to anyone, viewing contraception as a matter of private conscience rather than medical practice. The official government position was that the decision rested with the doctor, guided by what the policy called medical requirements. In practice, this meant that the reproductive autonomy of a woman in 1962 was determined not by her own decision, or by the announcement from Parliament, or by the existence of the technology itself, but by whether the particular man in her local surgery chose to give it to her. The surgery itself was a specific environment. The waiting room had wooden chairs, outdated magazines, and the faint medicinal smell of antiseptic that clung to every NHS facility of the era. A woman who had decided, after weeks or months of deliberation, to ask her doctor about the pill would sit in that waiting room alongside patients with coughs and broken fingers and children with measles waiting for her name to be called. The consultation room behind the frosted glass door was small, functional, and dominated by the desk of the doctor. The examination couch stood against one wall, covered with a paper sheet. The doctor sat behind the desk. The woman sat in front of it. The power dynamic was not subtle. She was asking a man in authority for permission to control her own body. The consultation lasted in most cases a few minutes. The decision, the pen moving or not moving across the prescription pad, could determine the next decade of her life. The prescription pad was a specific object, pale green NHS stationery, printed in a standard format, the handwriting of the doctor moving across its surface in a few seconds of ink. What was written on it, or not written on it, determined the next months and years of the woman sitting on the other side of the desk, and the woman had no appeal. If the doctor said no, there was no mechanism to overrule him. She could, if she had the means and the knowledge, seek another doctor. Many did not. Many lived in towns where one practice served the entire community, and the decision of the doctor was, for all practical purposes, final. She left the surgery with a prescription, or without one, and either way she left in silence, because the conversation she had just had was not one she could discuss with her neighbours, or her mother, or the women at the school gate. The subject was intimate, it was embarrassing, and it carried the weight of a moral judgment that the culture of the time imposed on any woman who sought to separate the act of sex from the consequence of pregnancy. The Family Planning Association, a voluntary organisation, operated clinics in some areas that provided contraceptive advice independently of the NHS. These clinics were staffed by doctors and nurses who were, by definition, sympathetic to family planning, and they offered an alternative for women whose own doctors had refused. But awareness of these clinics was uneven. A woman needed to know they existed, to know their locations and opening hours, and to be able to attend without the knowledge of a husband or a community that might judge her for going. The clinics themselves occupied modest premises, sometimes above shops, sometimes in community centres, and the discretion required to enter them was itself a form of social commentary. A woman who was seen entering a family planning association clinic was a woman whose reproductive intentions were, in the eyes of anyone who noticed, on public display. It was not until the National Health Service Family Planning Act of 1967, 6 years after the pill became technically available, that local health authorities were formally empowered to provide contraceptive advice to all women, regardless of marital status. Before this act, the NHS had no explicit obligation to provide contraceptive services at all. The pill existed. The NHS funded it. But no law required any doctor to prescribe it, and no law required any authority to make it available. And even after 1967, implementation depended on individual authorities, some of which were slow to comply. The access of a woman to family planning in the late 1960s still depended in part on where in Britain she happened to live. The pill was available in the abstract. In the particular surgery in the particular town, it might or might not be available to the particular woman who asked for it. The woman who had resigned from the school in 1962 sat in one of these surgeries in the second year of her marriage. She had decided that 2 children were enough. She had calculated, as she calculated everything, the cost in money, in time, in physical capacity, and she had arrived at a number. 2. She asked the doctor. The doctor considered. He looked at her notes. He asked questions about her health and her marriage. He prescribed the pill. She was fortunate. Not every woman who sat in that chair received the same answer. The prescription was written on the pale green pad, and she took it to the dispensary, and the pharmacist handed her a small box of tablets, and she walked home with a specific kind of relief that she would never describe to anyone but that she would remember for the rest of her life. The relief of a decision that was, at last, her own. But this was the condition of reproductive life in the early decade. Formal availability, practical inaccessibility, and a system in which the most intimate decisions of the existence of a woman were filtered through the moral judgment of a professional class that was overwhelmingly male. Reproductive control was only one dimension of the legal architecture that governed the body of a married woman. There was another, and it was older, simpler, and more absolute. Under the common law of England and Wales, as interpreted through a doctrine attributed to the 17th century jurist Sir Matthew Hale, a wife was held to have given irrevocable consent to sexual intercourse with her husband by the act of marriage itself. The doctrine was stated plainly. The reasoning was that the marriage contract constituted a permanent and binding agreement, and that consent given at the altar could not be withdrawn at any subsequent point. This was not a theoretical position preserved in legal textbooks. It was the active law of England and Wales. The courts upheld it. Prosecutors did not bring cases. Police did not investigate complaints. And the consequence was precise. Within the legal framework of the 1960s, a married woman in Britain could not, by definition, be raped by her husband. The act was not a crime because the law held that she had already agreed to it, permanently, on the day she married. This doctrine was not overturned until 1991. For the entirety of the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, the law of England and Wales held that the body of a wife was, in this specific and fundamental respect, not her own. The marriage certificate in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer that held the resignation letter and the housekeeping notebook, was also the document that, in the eyes of the law, had signed away the right to refuse. The domestic reality that accompanied this legal position was equally resistant to intervention. Domestic violence in the 1960s was routinely treated by the police as a private matter rather than a criminal one. Officers responding to reports of violence within a marriage frequently advised the woman to go home and resolve the situation within the family. The phrase was a standard response: go home and work it out. There was no specific domestic violence legislation. There were no refugees for women. A woman who left her husband because of violence had nowhere to go except the home of a relative or a friend, and the social stigma attached to a woman who had left her marriage, regardless of the reason, was sufficient to deter many from seeking help at all. The first refuge in Britain would not open until 1971, established by Erin Pizzey in Chiswick, and it will be another 5 years before the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act of 1976 provided the first targeted legal protections. A woman in 1963 who was being beaten by her husband had, in practical terms, nowhere to go and no law designed specifically to help her. The marks of domestic violence were visible to those who looked. A woman at the school gate with a bruise on her face, or a woman who wore long sleeves in summer, or a woman who flinched at a sudden movement. These were signs that other women recognized, and that the social conventions of the time prevented them from addressing directly. The code of privacy around the married home was total. What happened behind the front door was, by universal and unspoken agreement, not a matter for discussion. The phrase used was private business. The privacy was not that of the woman. It belonged to the institution. The woman who lived inside this framework, who managed the household budget, stretched the Sunday meat, relayed the fire, and calculated the week in shillings, also lived inside a body whose legal protections were, in the most critical respects, absent. She could not control her own fertility without the cooperation of a male doctor. She could not, in law, withhold consent from her husband. She could not, in practice, expect the police to intervene if that consent was violated by force. And if the consequence of these conditions was an unwanted pregnancy, the options available to her were determined, in their entirety, by how much money she had. Before the Abortion Act of 1967, abortion in Britain was effectively illegal. The Abortion Law Reform Association had been campaigning for change since 1936, 31 years of sustained, organised advocacy that would ultimately produce a partial and conditional reform. During those decades, medical professionals in hospitals across London and other cities regularly treated women who arrived with life, threatening complications from incomplete illegal procedures, infections, hemorrhage, and sepsis. The women who sought these procedures did so in desperation, often from practitioners who were unqualified and working in conditions that maximized risk. The women who died from them were overwhelmingly poor. Safe surgical termination was, in practice, already available in Britain throughout the 1950s and 60s, but only to women who could afford to pay for the services of compliant private doctors or sympathetic psychiatrists who could provide the necessary medical justification. The cost of such a procedure, conducted discreetly in a private clinic by a qualified doctor, was estimated at between £50 and £150. In a country where a female manual worker earned £7 to £11 per week, this was the equivalent of 3 to 5 months of wages. The procedure that cost a wealthy woman an afternoon cost a poor woman a calculation that might conclude in a backstreet room with an unqualified practitioner, a catheter, and a prayer. The Liberal MP David Steele, who introduced the bill that became the Abortion Act, cited a book published in 1960 by Alice Jenkins called Law for the Rich, which documented this precise inequality. The title said it all. Safe abortion was the prerogative of those who could pay. For those who could not, the alternatives were illegal, dangerous, and sometimes fatal. The hospitals knew, the doctors knew, the women who arrived by ambulance in the night knew, and the law, for 31 years, did nothing. The woman who had resigned from the school in 1962 was fortunate in this respect. She'd wanted 2 children, and she had them. Her doctor had prescribed the pill, but she knew women who were not fortunate. She knew, without being told in so many words, that the woman 3 doors down had been to someone, an address whispered, a name not spoken, and had come back pale and shaking and had not left her house for a week. These were the realities that sat beneath the surface of respectable domestic life in the early 1960s, as visible to the women who lived inside it as the frost on the bedroom window, and as invisible to the men who assumed that the system was working. The Abortion Act received royal assent on the 27th of October, 1967, and came into effect on the 27th of April, 1968. It legalized abortion under specific medical conditions, when the continuation of the pregnancy involved a greater risk to the physical or mental health of the woman than the termination, or when there was a substantial risk of serious handicap to the child. It was not and has never been an unconditional right. It required the agreement of 2 doctors. It required specific medical justification, and it did not apply in Northern Ireland, where women lived under the pre-1967 legal regime until 2019, more than 50 years after the rest of the United Kingdom had reformed. The decade between 1961 and 1967 therefore produced a specific and measurable change in the legal architecture governing the body of a woman. The pill became theoretically available. The Abortion Act made termination conditionally legal. The Family Planning Act created a formal obligation for the NHS to provide contraceptive advice. Each of these reforms represented years, and in some cases decades, of campaigning by specific, named individuals and organisations, and each of them was partial. The pill required a cooperative doctor. The Abortion Act required 2 doctors in specific medical circumstances. The Family Planning Act required cooperative local authorities. In every case, the final decision rested with someone other than the woman whose body was in question. The prescription pad closed. The pen was capped. The doctor moved to the next patient. What had just been decided was not, in many cases, written in the notes. And if the body was governed by one set of laws, the marriage itself was governed by another. A legal structure so rigid, so resistant to reality, and so productive of documented absurdity, that it had been the subject of parliamentary complaint for 35 years before it was finally reformed. In 1934, a writer named Alan Patrick Herbert, known to the public as a P. Herbert, published a satirical novel called Holy Deadlock. The book told the story of a couple who wanted, by mutual agreement, to end a marriage that had irretrievably broken down. They could not. The law of England and Wales did not permit divorce by mutual consent. The only grounds available were the so-called matrimonial offences, specific provable acts of wrongdoing by one partner against the other. In 1934, the only such offence that the courts consistently accepted was adultery. This meant that a couple who both wanted a divorce, who bore each other no ill will, and who had simply recognised that their marriage was finished, were required by law to produce evidence that one of them had committed a sexual act with a third party. Without that evidence, the marriage could not be legally dissolved. They were, in the title of the novel, locked together. And the lock was holy. The book sold 90,000 copies. It was described at the time as a tract for the times presented as fiction, and its success reflected a widespread public recognition that the divorce system was producing consequences that no reasonable person could defend. Herbert, who was a humorist, a contributor to the magazine Punch, and a man of considerable public profile, decided that satire alone was insufficient. He stood for Parliament in 1935 as an independent candidate for the University of Oxford and was elected. He then introduced a private bill that became the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1937. The 1937 Act expanded the grounds for divorce to include 3 additional offences beyond adultery: desertion for 3 years or more, cruelty, and incurable insanity. It was a significant reform, and Herbert was widely credited for achieving what decades of campaigning had not. But the fundamental architecture of the system remained intact. Divorce was still fault-based. Someone had to be guilty. Someone had to be the wronged party. And the court still required evidence of a specific, provable offence before it would dissolve a marriage, regardless of the wishes of the people inside it. The personal cost of this system was not merely legal. It was emotional, financial, and social. A woman who wished to divorce her husband but could not prove adultery, cruelty, or desertion was simply trapped. She remained married to a man she wished to leave, in a house that might or might not be safe, in an arrangement that the law considered permanent and that she experienced as imprisonment. The gap between the legal category of marriage and the lived reality of marriage was, for these women, absolute. The law said they were married. They said they were done. The law won. In 1951, a Labour MP named Irene White introduced a private bill that proposed allowing divorce after 7 years of separation, with or without the consent of the other party. The bill was not passed. Instead, the government established a Royal Commission on Marriage and Divorce, chaired by Lord Morton of Henriton, to investigate the state of the law. The commission sat for 5 years, gathering evidence, hearing testimony, and deliberating. It reported in 1956. Its majority conclusion was to resist reform. The commission reaffirmed the matrimonial offence as the sole basis for divorce, arguing that the stability of marriage was paramount and that permitting divorce by separation would undermine the institution. 10 years of political effort, the bill introduced by White, the establishment of the commission, the 5-year investigation, had produced nothing. The law remained unchanged. The marriages remained locked. A minority report, however, dissented. Several members of the commission argued that the fault-based system was producing more harm than it prevented, that the requirement to prove wrongdoing was encouraging fabrication, perjury, and bitterness, and that a system designed to protect the institution of marriage was, in practice, degrading it. This minority view would, over the next decade, become the majority position. But in 1956, the dissenting commissioners were outvoted. The locked marriages remained locked. The women inside them continued to manage the households, raise the children, and relay the fires in houses that the law would not allow them to leave. And so the system continued, and the system, by the 1960s, had developed an industry around its own impossibility. The practice was called hotel evidence. It worked as follows. A husband. It was almost always the husband, because the legal and social burden of being named as an adulterer fell more heavily on women, would travel to a seaside hotel. Brighton, Bournemouth, Southend. The geography of the hotel divorce was provincial, practical, unremarkable. He would check into the hotel with a woman who was not his wife. She might be a professional acquaintance or someone arranged through informal networks. In some cases, agencies existed specifically to provide a suitable companion for the purpose. The husband and the woman would be seen together by hotel staff, a chambermaid, a night porter, in circumstances that suggested they had shared a room. The hotel register would record the name of the man, followed by the words "and wife." This was the documentary foundation of the process, a register entry in ink in a seaside hotel that constituted the first piece of evidence in what would become a legal proceeding. An inquiry agent, a private investigator hired specifically for the purpose, would conduct surveillance. He would observe the couple, note their arrival, and later testify in court that the circumstances were consistent with adultery. His footsteps in the hotel corridor, walking past the door of the room, pausing, listening, were the documented sounds of the system at work. The legal standard was not proof of the act itself, but evidence of what the courts called inclination and opportunity, a demonstration that the parties had both the desire and the means to commit the offence. The testimony of the inquiry agent was the bridge between the staged event and the legal conclusion. The entire system depended on a fiction, and the fiction required perjury. The adultery had not, in most cases, actually occurred. The couple at the hotel were performing a scene designed to satisfy a legal requirement that bore no relationship to the reality of their marriage, but they were required to swear under oath in open court that the events were genuine. If a judge suspected collusion, if it became apparent that both parties had cooperated in arranging the evidence, the petition could be refused. The law prohibited divorce by mutual consent, and collusion was interpreted as a form of consent. This meant that the participants in a hotel divorce were required to lie convincingly about the fact that they had conspired to lie. The system required perjury, punished honesty, and produced the specific legal outcome that both parties had wanted from the beginning, but were forbidden from requesting directly. The consequences extended beyond the couple. The co-respondent, the person named in the petition as the partner in adultery was identified in open court. Because divorce proceedings in the 1960s were conducted almost exclusively through the High Court, there was no family court, no separate family division. And because hearings were open to the public and to the press, the name of the co-respondent could be, and frequently was, published in local newspapers. The smell of a newly printed local newspaper in the 1960s, a specific acrid ink smell, was for some families associated with the public exposure of private shame. A woman who agreed to serve as the staged partner in a hotel divorce, or a man named as the supposed lover of the wife, could find their name and their alleged behaviour reproduced in print for the consumption of neighbours, employers, and acquaintances. The social cost of cooperating with the fiction of the system was not borne equally. It fell disproportionately on those who had the least power to absorb it. The courtroom itself was a specific physical space, high ceilings, no central heating in the older High Court buildings, the particular cold of institutional stone. A woman giving evidence about the most intimate details of her marriage in that room was required to stand and answer questions in a space that was open to the public gallery, where wooden benches held whatever members of the public and the press chose to attend. She would be wearing her coat, because the building was not well heated, and she had not been invited to remove it. The petition she had filed, typed in legal language on court paper with its particular dry, dusty institutional smell, was read aloud. The private catastrophe of her marriage had become a legal procedure, conducted in public, before a judge who had the power to refuse it if the evidence was not convincing enough. The cost of accessing this system was itself a barrier. An initial consultation with the solicitor fee in the 1960s could consume the wages of a week for a working woman. For a woman who was not working, who had resigned under the marriage bar and had no independent income, The cost was effectively prohibitive without the cooperation of the man whose behaviour had made the consultation necessary. The office of the solicitor, old paper, floor polish, a faint tobacco smell, was a space many women entered only once, if at all. The waiting room of the solicitor had wooden chairs, a counter, a clerk who did not meet her eyes. The click of the dictaphone as the solicitor began recording the notes of the first consultation was the start of a legal process that, for the average woman, would take months, require evidence that might need to be manufactured, and conclude in a hearing that was open to anyone who wished to attend. Tea was served at the first consultation with the solicitor, a cup and saucer brought in by the receptionist, a specific domestic courtesy extended into an institutional setting. It marked the moment when the private catastrophe of a marriage became a legal procedure. The woman sat in a chair that was not her own, in a room that smelled of floor polish and old paper, holding a cup of tea that she had not made, and described the facts of her life to a man who would charge her for listening. The pen of the solicitor moved across a notepad. The dictaphone, if he used one, clicked softly when he pressed the button to record. The details she provided, the dates, the circumstances, the specific nature of the complaint, would be translated into legal language, typed on court paper and filed at the High Court Divorce Registry on the Strand in London. The specific paper smell of a court filing, dry, slightly dusty, institutional, was the smell of the process that would follow. And if a woman could not afford hotel evidence, and could not prove cruelty, and could not prove desertion, she could try to leave without a divorce. But a woman who had separated from her husband but not yet obtained a divorce occupied a particular legal space. The house she lived in was legally his, if his name alone was on the deeds. She was there on sufferance, with no formal right of occupation, a status that the Matrimonial Homes Act of 1967 would partially address, but that, before that year, left her entirely at the mercy of the owner. She could be told to leave. She had no mechanism in law to refuse. The kitchen of a woman in this position, separated but not divorced, living in a house that belonged to someone she was trying to leave, was a specific and measurable form of domestic purgatory. She cooked in it, cleaned it, managed the household from it. It was, in every practical sense, her domain. In every legal sense, it was not. A woman who wanted to make a telephone call to a solicitor but did not want the call recorded on the house telephone, because the telephone bill came in the name of her husband and he would see the number, could walk to the nearest public telephone box and call from there. The sound of a phone box in 1960s Britain was specific and procedural. The pips, the pressing of button A to connect, the coins dropped into the slot. This was the sound a woman heard when she began the process of leaving a marriage. Not the dramatic sound of confrontation or decision, but the sound of coins and mechanics in a box on a street corner on a Tuesday afternoon when no one was looking. The alternative to hotel evidence was the other available grounds, and each presented its own specific documented barriers. Cruelty, as defined under the 1937 Act, required evidence of physical harm. Emotional cruelty, financial control, sustained humiliation, and systematic isolation were not, throughout most of the 1960s, recognized by the courts as meeting the legal threshold. Court records document cases in which women presented medical evidence of sustained physical assault and were told that the evidence did not satisfy the requirements for a finding of cruelty as a matrimonial offence. The bar was set at a height that many women, despite years of documented abuse, could not clear. Desertion required proof that one party had abandoned the other for a continuous period of 3 years or more. The critical word was continuous. A husband who left and then returned for even a single night could, under the legal interpretation of the time, reset the desertion clock. The wife would then be required to wait another 3 years before she could petition again. 6 months of documented separation, during which any contact with the husband could legally reset the clock. The effect was to give the departing spouse a mechanism for indefinitely delaying the legal consequences of having left, simply by reappearing at intervals that interrupted the required period of absence. By the mid-1960s, the weight of evidence against the system had become difficult to ignore. The Law Commission, established in 1965 to review and modernise the law of England and Wales, identified the fault-based divorce system as one of its most urgent priorities. In its assessment, the system was producing widespread perjury, collusion, and deceit in the courts, a finding delivered in the language of institutional understatement but with unmistakable force. The lawyers in the Law Commission offices in Chancery Lane reviewed the evidence of manufactured adultery, staged hotel scenes, and perjured testimony, and wrote in their reports that the system had brought the administration of justice into disrepute. In 1966, the study group of the Archbishop of Canterbury published a report titled Putting Asunder, which argued that the concept of irretrievable breakdown should replace the matrimonial offence as the basis for divorce. The report was significant not only for its conclusions but for its source. The Church of England, and the institution most closely associated with the defence of marriage as a lifelong commitment, was acknowledging that the existing system was causing more harm to the institution of marriage than any reform could. The law that was supposed to protect marriage was, in the documented assessment of the Church itself, destroying it. The Divorce Reform Act was enacted in 1969 and came into effect on the 1st of January 1971. It allowed couples to divorce on the basis of irretrievable breakdown, evidence by adultery, unreasonable behaviour, desertion for 2 years, separation for 2 years with consent, or separation for 5 years without consent. It was, at last, possible to end a marriage without staging a crime. The numbers confirmed what the reformers had long argued. In 1971, the first full year of the new system, there were approximately 50,000 divorces. Within a decade, that number tripled to 150,000. The increase was not evidence that marriages were suddenly failing at 3 times the previous rate. It was evidence that vast numbers of people had been legally trapped in marriages they had wanted to leave for years, sometimes decades, and that the moment the law provided a mechanism for departure, they used it. The tripling of the divorce rate was not a crisis. It was the sound of a release valve opening. The woman who had resigned from the school in 1962 heard this sound. She was still in the same house, in the same town, in the same kitchen where the housekeeping notebook sat on the same table. The coal fire still needed relaying. The children still needed feeding. But the legal world around her had shifted, and she knew it. She read the newspapers. She heard the radio. She knew that the Married Women Property Act had changed the status of her savings, that the Matrimonial Homes Act had given her a right to remain in the house, that the pill was available, and the Abortion Act had been passed, and the Family Planning Act had created new obligations for local authorities. She knew that other women were leaving marriages that had once seemed permanent. She knew, too, that the women who had arranged hotel evidence and committed perjury in the old system had done so not out of dishonesty, but out of the same desperate arithmetic that she herself performed every week in the housekeeping notebook, a calculation of what was possible, what was necessary, and what the system required. The question she faced now, the question that every woman of her generation faced, was whether the changes had come in time for her, or whether the gap between the old law and the new had already consumed the years she could not recover. The hotel register at Bournemouth closed. The inquiry agent drove home. The system had produced the evidence the law required. It had produced nothing else. But the law was not only a matter of what a woman could not leave, it was also a matter of what she could not earn, or rather, what she was permitted to earn, and how much less that was than the man doing the same work at the next machine. The question of money was not separate from the question of freedom. It was the same question, asked in a different register. In the early 1960s, the arithmetic of the gender wage gap in Britain was specific, documented, and unapologetic. A woman working in a manual occupation earned, on average, between £7 and £11 per week. A man in an equivalent role earned between 14 and 20, £2. The gap was not hidden. It was not a matter of interpretation or statistical nuance. It was embedded in formal pay structures, separate scales for men and women, different job categories applied to identical tasks, and a cultural assumption, shared by employers, unions, and the state, that the wage of a woman was supplementary income rather than the foundation of a household. The phrase used was secondary income. The implication was that her work was secondary too. A married woman who kept her factory job through the 1960s earned, in a year, roughly what her husband earned in 6 months. The same hours, the same effort, half the pay. This assumption persisted despite the fact that, for a significant proportion of families, the wage of the woman was not secondary at all. It was the difference between managing and not managing. A household in which both partners worked survived on a combined income that, while modest, covered the essentials. A household in which the income of the wife was lost, to pregnancy, to the marriage bar, to the assumption that she should not be working, was immediately more vulnerable. The economy of the 1960s depended on the labour of women in its factories, its shops, its offices, and its schools. The pay structures of the 1960s treated that labour as a favour the economy was doing her. The mechanisms by which the gap was maintained were not always crude. Sometimes they were sophisticated, embedded in classification systems that appeared neutral but produced predictable results. The job grading system used by major employers assigned work to categories: unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled, and the assignment was not always based on the content of the work itself. Work performed predominantly by women tended to be classified at a lower level than work of equivalent complexity performed by men. The classification determined the pay determined the life. And the woman who challenged the classification was not challenging a number on a piece of paper. She was challenging the assumption that the work her hands performed was worth less than the work performed by the hands of the man at the next machine. The principle of equal pay for women had been recommended by a royal commission as early as 1946. Implementation for teachers and civil servants was phased in between 1955 and 1961, a process that itself took 6 years. But the private sector was entirely unaffected. The gap between the recommendation and any enforceable legislation was, by the late 1960s, 24 years and counting. A woman who had read the 1946 recommendation at the age of 20 would be 44 before equal pay for the public sector was fully implemented, and 54 before the Equal Pay Act of 1970 came into force in 1975. The distance between what was obviously right and what the law was willing to enforce was measured not in arguments, but in decades. The bus timetable pinned inside a kitchen cupboard told its own story. A woman working a factory shift organised her day around public transport, which in many towns stopped running before the last shift ended, meaning she walked home in the dark, on streets that were poorly lit, earning half what the man on the machine next to hers took home, to a household where no one had needed to manage the daily arithmetic of food and coal and rent. The walk home was part of the cost that was never calculated, the time and the risk and the exhaustion of a journey that a higher wage might have made unnecessary, because a higher wage might have covered the cost of a taxi, or a car, or simply the dignity of not walking alone at 10 at night through streets where the only other people walking were men. On the 7th of June 1968, 187 women sewing machinists at the Ford Motor Company plant in Dagenham, Essex, walked off the factory floor. The immediate cause was a regrading exercise that had classified their work as Category B, semi-skilled, rather than Category C, which would have recognised them as skilled workers. The difference between the two categories was 15% of their pay. The women who stitched the seat covers for every car that left the Dagenham production line were being told, in the specific language of industrial classification, that what they did required less expertise than the work performed by men on the same factory floor. The regrading had been the result of a job evaluation exercise conducted by Ford management in cooperation with the trade unions. The evaluation was supposed to be objective, a rational assessment of the skill, effort and responsibility required by each role. But the evaluation was conducted by men, assessed by men, and implemented in a system where the assumption that work performed by women was inherently less skilled had been built into the institutional culture for so long that it was invisible to the people who operated within it. The machinists at Dagenham were operating industrial sewing machines, heavy, powerful equipment that required precision, consistency, and physical endurance. The leather and vinyl from which the car seat covers were cut had to be stitched to exact specifications. A crooked seam, an uneven edge, a thread tension that was too loose or too tight would produce a visible defect in a product that bore the Ford name. The work required training, concentration, and a level of manual dexterity that, in any other industry, would have been classified as skilled. But it was performed by women, and the classification system classified it accordingly. The factory floor itself was a specific physical space. Long rows of sewing machines under fluorescent lighting, the smell of fabric dust and machine oil mixing with the scent of the canteen, the warmth of the machines and the closeness of women working in rows that stretched the length of the building. The noise was constant, the rhythmic hammering of needles through leather and vinyl, the whir of electric motors, the occasional clatter of a bobbin being replaced. Conversation was conducted in the intervals between the noise, in brief exchanges shouted across machines, in the tea breaks that punctuated the shift. The women knew each other. They knew the children of one another, the husbands of one another, the financial situations of one another's situations. The factory floor was not merely a workplace, it was a community, and the decision to walk out was not made by individuals in isolation. It was made collectively, by women who had discussed it over tea, who had weighed the financial cost of lost wages against the principle at stake, and who had decided together that the principle was worth the cost. It was warm in a way that the houses many of them went home to were not. When the 187 machinists picked up their coats and walked out, the machines fell silent behind them. It was not a dramatic moment in the way that labour history usually produces dramatic moments. No barricades, no confrontation, no speeches on the factory steps, just women leaving and the sound of machines stopping, one by one, down the length of the floor. The silence that followed was its own form of statement. The room that had hummed and clattered all day was suddenly completely still. Within days the strike had spread. Workers at the Ford plant in Hale near Liverpool joined the action. 850 machinists were ultimately involved. The women walked picket lines outside the factory gates in their coats and headscarves, carrying handmade signs. The signs were direct, unambiguous, and grammatically correct. And within 3 weeks, 22 days, from the 7th of June to the 29th, the entire Dagenham production line had ground to a halt. The reason was precise and mechanical. The car seat covers that the machinists produced could not be made by anyone else. No other workers in the factory had the training or the equipment. Without seat covers, the cars could not be completed. Without completed cars, the factory had no product. The most powerful automotive manufacturer in Britain had been stopped by the women who stitched its upholstery. The leverage was total, and it was for the women who'd been classified as semi-skilled, a form of proof that no grading exercise could deny. On the 29th of June 1968, 3 weeks into the strike, the Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity, Barbara Castle, met with 8 representatives of the striking women at the ministry. She insisted that no male trade union officials attend the meeting. She insisted that no Ford executives attend. It was a meeting between a female cabinet minister and 8 female factory workers, and the exclusion of the men who normally spoke on behalf of both was deliberate and unprecedented. Castle brought with her the text of a draft equal pay bill. She showed it to the representatives of the women as evidence that the government intended legislative action beyond the immediate dispute. She then brokered a settlement. The women would return to work. Their pay would be immediately raised to 92% of the male rate, up from 85%. Full parity at the Category B level would follow the next year, 92%, not 100. The women had walked out because they were paid 15% less than men for comparable work, and they returned having closed the gap to 8%. It was a significant victory. It was not equality. The demand they had originally made, to be reclassified as skilled workers, Category C, was not granted. It would not be granted until a further 6-week strike in 1984, 16 years later. The women who walked out in 1968 would wait nearly 2 decades for the full recognition they had sought in the first place. But the ripple effects of the Dagenham strike extended far beyond the factory gates. The strike had demonstrated, in terms that were impossible to ignore, that the labour of women was not supplementary. It was essential. The production line had stopped. The cars had not been built. The revenue had not been earned. The argument that work done by women was less valuable than that of men had been tested against the simple fact that without the work of women the product did not exist. The strike had turned an abstract principle into a concrete, measurable, undeniable economic reality. The Equal Pay Act received a royal assent on the 29th of May, 1970. It mandated that women could no longer be paid less than men for the same or broadly similar work. But it did not come into force until the 29th of December, 1975. Employers were given 5 years to adjust their pay structures. During those 5 years, the discrimination the Act was designed to prevent remained legal. A woman who had fought for equal pay in 1968 would not have the protection of law until 1975, 7 years later. And the broader systemic issues that produced the wage gap, occupational segregation, the devaluation of work performed by women, the assumption that female employment was temporary, were not addressed by the legislation at all. The Act addressed the symptom, the cause, the deep structural assumption that the labour of a woman was worth less than that of a man would take decades more to confront, and the confrontation is not yet complete. On the 29th of June, 1968, Barbara Castle closed her briefcase. The 8 women filed out of the ministry. The machines at Dagenham would restart the following day. The equal pay bill was in the briefcase. It would not become law for another 2 years. It would not come into force for 7. Barbara Castle was the 4th woman ever to sit in the British cabinet, appointed in 1964. She was the first woman to hold the office of First Secretary of State. She operated in a parliament that was, throughout the 1960s, between 95 and 96% male. The laws governing every aspect of the daily lives of women, their wages, their property, their bodies, their marriages, their children, were written, debated and enacted by a legislative body in which women held fewer than 5% of the seats. The women who fought for change did so within an institution that had been designed, staffed and governed by the people whose assumptions they were attempting to overturn. And Castle was not alone. She was one of 2 women whose legislative work defined the decade for married women in Britain. The other was Edith Summerskill. Summerskill was a doctor, a Labour politician, and a campaigner whose career in public life had begun before the Second World War. She had entered the House of Commons in 1938 and remained in political life, moving to the House of Lords as a life peer for more than 4 decades. Her focus throughout the 1960s was the legal and financial vulnerability of married women, the specific, measurable ways in which the law failed to protect women within the institution it claimed to uphold. The Married Women Property Act of 1964 was her achievement. 21 years of sustained political effort to establish a principle that could be stated in a single sentence. The money a wife saved from her housekeeping belonged in law to her as well as to her husband. The Act overturned the Blackwell versus Blackwell precedent that had governed the question since 1943, and it did so because one woman had decided 2 decades earlier that the principle was worth the fight. The campaign had survived changes of government, shifts in political priority, and the persistent corrosive assumption that the financial arrangements of a marriage were a private matter and not a concern of the state. Summerskill had outlasted them all. But the 1964 Act, as important as it was, addressed only housekeeping savings. It did not establish the right of a wife to a share of the matrimonial home. It did not protect a woman whose husband owned the house in his name alone. It did not address the question of what happened to a woman who had spent 20 or 30 years managing a household, raising children and maintaining the domestic economy, only to find that the house in which she had performed all of this labour did not belong to her. The wallpaper she had chosen, the curtains she had sewn, the garden she had maintained, all of these improvements were, in legal terms, improvements to his property. She had increased the value of an asset she did not own. Summerskill understood this gap. She understood it not as an abstraction, but as a specific documented pattern of harm that she had seen in her medical practice and in her political casework. Women wrote to her. They described their situations in letters that accumulated in her parliamentary office. Letters in pencil, in careful handwriting, on lined paper, describing marriages that had ended in everything but law, and the specific financial consequences of a system that treated the home as the property of the person whose name was on the deeds, rather than the person whose labour had maintained it. In 1967, Summerskill introduced the Matrimonial Homes Act. This legislation established for the first time that a spouse had a legal right to occupy the matrimonial home, regardless of whose name was on the deeds. Before this act, a husband could legally eject his wife from the family home with no legal mechanism for her to resist. He could change the locks. He could sell the property. He could, in cases that were documented in legal records, bring another woman into the house and present the wife with a choice between staying under those conditions and leaving with nothing. The act did not give her ownership. It gave her the right to stay. For a woman who had spent years cooking in a kitchen, laying fires in a sitting room, and raising children in bedrooms that frosted on the inside in winter, the right to remain in the house she had maintained was not a legal abstraction. It was the difference between a home and the street. And Summerskill, unlike many reformers, was willing to be unpopular among her own allies. When proposals for divorce reform gathered momentum in the mid-1960s, proposals that would allow divorce after a period of separation without requiring proof of fault, Summerskill opposed them. She called them what she believed they were. She used the phrase the Casanova Charter. Her argument was specific and documented. A woman who had spent 20 years as an unpaid household manager, who had resigned her career at the marriage bar, raised the children, maintained the home, and built no pension, no credit record, and no employment history, had earned a financial claim on the marriage. To allow a husband to walk away after a period of separation without the requirement of proving fault was to allow him to abandon the economic consequences of a partnership in which the woman had invested everything she had. Summerskill argued that the movement for women, in its enthusiasm for liberation, was failing to account for the economic reality of the women it claimed to represent. History has been slow to decide whether she was right, but the evidence that followed the Divorce Reform Act suggests that her warnings were not unfounded. In the years immediately after the Act came into force in 1971, many women who divorced found themselves in precisely the situation Summerskill had predicted. They had no pension. They had no employment history. They had no independent credit record. Their names were not on the deeds to the homes they had lived in for decades. The act that freed them from marriages they wanted to leave had not provided any mechanism for financial protection after departure. They were free to go. They had nowhere to stand. Summerskill died in 1980. She did not live to see the full consequences of the reform she had both championed and cautioned against, but the specific pattern she had warned about, the impoverishment of older divorced women who had spent their adult lives in unpaid domestic labour, became one of the defining social issues of the 1970s and 1980s. The pension gaps she had identified, the credit gaps she had documented, the employment gaps she had warned about, all of these materialized precisely as she had predicted in the specific circumstances of specific women who'd been promised liberation and delivered into a form of freedom they could not afford. The legislative achievements of the decade were real and should not be diminished. The Married Women Property Act of 1964, the Matrimonial Homes Act of 1967, the Abortion Act of 1967, the National Health Service Family Planning Act of 1967, the Divorce Reform Act of 1969, the Equal Pay Act of 1970. Each of these represented years of work by specific people against specific resistance, each one of them a single sentence of justice that had required decades of argument to write into law. And each was partial. What the decade did not address was equally specific. Marital rape remained legal until 1991. Equal custody of children was not established until the Guardianship Act of 1973, meaning that in the critical period when women were finally gaining access to divorce, they still did not have equal legal standing over their own children. The full ban on sex discrimination in financial services did not arrive until 1975. Domestic violence legislation followed in 1976. The reforms came in sequence, not in concert, and the gaps between them were measured in years during which women lived inside the contradictions. Free to divorce, but not to claim equal custody. Free to work, but not to earn equally. Free to apply for credit, but not to receive it without discrimination. The timeline of reform, when laid out in sequence, reveals not a march of progress, but a staggered, halting series of corrections, each one arriving after the damage it was designed to prevent had already been done. Edith Summerskill closed her papers. The Matrimonial Homes Act had passed. A woman who would otherwise have been locked out of her own home by her own husband was, as of that day, protected. It was a limited protection. It was better than what existed yesterday. And tomorrow there would be another bill, another campaign, another argument for another principle that could be stated in a single sentence. That was the nature of the work. It did not end. On the 1st of January 1971, the Divorce Reform Act came into force. The morning light filtered through the same net curtains in the same kitchen of the same terrace house. The coal fire had been relayed. The kettle was on. The housekeeping notebook sat in its usual place on the table, and the legal world behind those curtains, the world that governed what the woman inside the house could do, could earn, could own, could leave, was different from what it had been the day before. The woman who'd resigned from the school in January of 1962 was now 38. 9 years had passed. She had spent every one of them outside the workforce. Her pension contributions had stopped on the day she accepted the marriage gratuity. That lump sum that had seemed at the time like a generous farewell gift, and that she now understood had been the price at which her financial future was purchased and cancelled. Her name was not and had never been on the mortgage. The bank account was in the name of her husband because the bank had required his signature when it was opened, and the question of whose name was on it had not seemed important at the time. It seemed important now. Her credit history did not exist, because no lender had ever assessed her as an independent financial entity. The hire, purchase book, the television rental agreement, the mortgage, all bore his name, his signature, his identity as the legitimate financial actor in the household. She had managed the money. He had owned the accounts. She had raised children, managed a household, calculated the weekly budget in pencil, stretched Sunday meat through 4 days of the week, and maintained the domestic economy of a family on £14 a week, rising to 22 by the end of the decade, with a level of skill, discipline, and sustained effort that would have been recognised in any other context as professional competence. Her national insurance card, the physical card that was stamped by employers each week and that determined her entitlement to state benefits, had gaps in it that stretched for years. Those gaps could not be filled retroactively. They would follow her for the rest of her life. When she reached pension age, those years of unstamped contributions would produce a reduced payment. The marriage gratuity, that one-time handshake in 1962, would cost her every month for the rest of her retirement. Her children were now 7 and 9. They went to school in the morning and came home in the afternoon and required, in their particular way, the same daily attention that the house required. They needed to be fed, clothed, transported, supervised, helped with homework, taken to the doctor, comforted when they were afraid, and managed when they were difficult. This labour, the labour of raising children, was so constant, so interwoven with every other form of domestic work, that it was almost impossible to isolate as a separate task. A woman who was cooking was also supervising. A woman who was ironing was also answering questions. A woman who was balancing the household budget was also calculating the cost of new school shoes against the cost of resolving the shoes that could be mended one more time. The children made the domestic labour harder. They also made leaving harder. A woman who was considering divorce in 1971 was considering not only where she would live and how she would support herself, but what would happen to her children, who would care for them during working hours, how they would be housed, how their lives would be disrupted, and what legal authority she would have over decisions that affected them. The Divorce Reform Act gave her the legal right to petition for the dissolution of a marriage on the basis of irretrievable breakdown. She no longer needed to prove a crime. She no longer needed to arrange hotel evidence, hire an inquiry agent, identify a co-respondent, or perjure herself in open court. She could leave. The law had changed. The morning of the 1st of January 1971 was, in legal terms, a different country from the evening of the 31st of December 1970. But leaving required somewhere to go, and the specific documented circumstances of a woman who had resigned her career in 1962, spent a decade outside the workforce, and built no financial independence of any kind meant that the freedom the new law provided was, for her generation, conditional on resources that the old law had systematically prevented her from acquiring. The act that freed her had not created the conditions for freedom. It had opened a door. On the other side of the door was the same economy, the same banking system, the same labour market that had excluded her for 9 years, the same lenders who had refused her credit without the signature of a husband, the same employers who had expected her to leave when she married, and who now, if she applied for work, would ask about the 9-year gap in her employment history, and would draw their own conclusions. The question of returning to work was itself fraught with practical barriers. Childcare provision in Britain in 1971 was minimal. State-funded nursery places were scarce. Private childcare was expensive. A woman who wished to return to teaching, the profession she'd been trained for and had practiced for 7 years, would need to update her qualifications, find a school willing to hire her, and arrange reliable childcare for 2 children during school hours and holidays. The cost of childcare could consume a substantial proportion of her potential earnings, particularly if she returned at the lower end of the pay scale after a 9-year absence. The arithmetic of returning to work, weighing the cost of childcare against the income from employment, factoring in transport and professional clothing, and the loss of time available for household management, was, for many women, a calculation that did not produce a positive number. The economics of the situation had been structured in a way that made staying at home the financially rational choice, even when the woman wanted to work. The family Bible or household register in which her marriage had been recorded sat alongside the resignation letter in the kitchen drawer. The name of the woman in that register had moved from the house of her father to the house of her husband. The question the new law posed was whether it could move again, this time to a house of her own. The answer for many women of her generation was not yet. The tripling of the divorce rate in the decade after 1971, from 50,000 to 150,000, was not, as the conservative press of the time suggested, evidence of moral collapse. It was evidence that the marriages which had been legally maintained by the impossibility of leaving them were, in vast numbers already finished. The new law did not destroy these marriages, it allowed them to end. And the women who emerged from them, older, without employment records, without pensions, without credit, without their names on deeds, entered a world that had changed its laws faster than its assumptions. They were pioneers of a kind, these women who left in the early 1970s. They walked through the door that the Divorce Reform Act had opened. Many of them walked through it into poverty. The Equal Pay Act would not come into force until 1975. The Sex Discrimination Act, which would make it illegal for banks to require the signature of a husband, would not arrive until the same year. Equal parental rights would not be established until the Guardianship Act of 1973. The timing of these reforms was not merely a matter of legislative sequence. It was a matter of lived consequence. A woman who left her marriage in 1971 was entering a labour market that was still legally permitted to pay her less than a man for the same work, a financial system that was still permitted to refuse her credit on the basis of her sex, and a custody framework in which her husband still held a legally superior position over their children. She was free to go, but the world she was going into had not yet been built for her arrival. She walked through the door and found the room on the other side still under construction. The Guardianship Act of 1973 deserves particular attention in this sequence. It was the legislation that finally established fully equal parental rights for mothers and fathers in England and Wales. Before this act, a father retained a legally superior position in matters of guardianship, a position inherited from the common law presumption that a child was the property and later the responsibility of the father. The Guardianship of Infants Act of 1925 had begun to erode this presumption, introducing the principle that the welfare of the child should be the paramount consideration. But the 1925 Act had not established full equality between parents. The rights of a father remained, in law and in practice, superior to those of a mother in matters of custody, education, religion, and medical treatment. This meant that a woman who divorced her husband in 1971 or 1972, newly free under the Divorce Reform Act, could find that decisions about the education of her children, medical treatment and movement were still subject to the authority of her husband. She could leave the marriage, but she could not take her children with her on equal legal terms. The act that freed her from the marriage had not freed her from the hierarchy within it. For the woman who had resigned in 1962, this was not an abstract legal concern. Her children were 7 and 9. They were the centre of her daily life and the primary reason she had stayed at home. Every decision she had made since her resignation had been made with them in mind. The meals she cooked, the household she managed, the medical appointments she kept, the homework she supervised, the bedtime routines she maintained. She was, in every practical and observable respect, the primary parent. And yet, in law, she was the junior one. The father who came home at 5:30, who ate the meals she had prepared and sat in the chair she had cleaned, held a superior legal claim over the children she had raised. This was not a matter of individual malice. It was a matter of institutional design. The law had been written by men who assumed that fathers knew best, and the assumption had survived into a decade that was supposed to be changing everything. The historian Sheila Rowbotham, writing about the experiences of women in the 1960s, described the decade as one in which women could see clearly enough what was happening to them, but the language for describing it, and the law for addressing it, had not yet been invented. This formulation captures something precise about the condition of the generation that lived through those years. They were not ignorant of their situation. They were articulate, capable, and aware. They read the newspapers and heard the radio and followed the parliamentary debates and understood, in their own terms, the gap between what they experienced and what the law provided. But the institutional frameworks that could have given their awareness material consequences, the laws, the policies, the financial structures, the social infrastructure, arrived late, arrived partially, and arrived in a sequence that left gaps large enough for an entire generation to fall through. The sequence itself tells the story. The Married Women Property Act in 1964, the Matrimonial Homes Act in 1967, the Family Planning Act in 1967, the Abortion Act in 1967, the Divorce Reform Act in 1969, the Equal Pay Act in 1970, not enforced until 1975, the Guardianship Act in 1973, the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, the Domestic Violence Act in 1976, the overturning of the marital rape exemption in 1991. Spread across 27 years, from 1964 to 1991, these reforms addressed, one by one, the specific legal disabilities that had defined the position of the married woman in British law. But they arrived in a sequence that meant a woman who benefited from the earliest reform had to wait another 27 years for the last. The distance between the first act and the last was longer than the marriage of many of the women the acts were designed to protect. The gaps were not theoretical, they were specific. A woman who read the 1946 Royal Commission recommendation on equal pay at the age of 20 would be 44 before the public sector fully implemented it, and 54 before the Equal Pay Act came into force. A woman who resigned under the marriage bar in 1962 would find in 1975 that the pension gap she'd incurred at the age of 29 could not be recovered. A woman who endured a violent marriage throughout the 1960s would find, if she survived, that the first legal tools designed specifically to protect her were not available until 1976. A woman who bore a child she did not want because a doctor declined to prescribe the pill and the local hospital treated the consequences of illegal alternatives would find that the law changed 6 years too late for her, or 5, or 3. The distances were specific. They were measured in years. And the women who lived inside those distances did so not as historical subjects awaiting reform, but as people managing the daily business of survival, relaying fires, balancing budgets, raising children, stretching meals, walking home in the dark from factory shifts that paid half what the men earned, inside a framework that had been designed without consulting them and was being reformed without compensating them. The specific population of women who lost the most in these gaps were those who had done exactly what they were told. They had resigned their careers at the marriage bar, they had accepted the gratuity, they had raised the children, they had managed the household, they had done everything the society of the 1950s and early 1960s had asked of them, with competence and without complaint, and the reward for their compliance was a pension gap, a credit gap, an employment gap, and a legal status that left them, when the decade of reform arrived, less equipped to take advantage of the new freedoms than the younger women who'd never lived under the old constraints. They were, in the specific and measurable terms of the actuarial tables, the generation that paid for the transition. The women who came after them inherited the rights. The women who'd lived through the gap inherited the costs. The material conditions of their daily lives were changing too in ways that were visible and concrete. The coal fire that had required relaying before dawn was being replaced, in new council houses and in the expanding suburbs, by central heating systems that warmed every room and demanded nothing more than the turning of a dial. The mangle that had wrung water from sheets on a Monday morning was giving way to the twin-tub washing machine, which sat in the kitchen and reduced a full day of labour to a few hours of waiting. The scullery sink where vegetables had been scrubbed in cold water was being replaced by fitted kitchens with stainless steel basins and hot running water from an immersion heater. These were real improvements. They reduced the physical burden of domestic work in ways that were immediate and measurable. But they did not change the legal status of the woman who operated them. A woman loading a washing machine in 1968 was performing less physically demanding work than a woman operating a mangle in 1952, but her legal claim to the household assets, her pension entitlement, and her custodial rights over her children had not improved at the same pace as the appliances in her kitchen. The technology had advanced. The law had not kept up. The coal fire in the sitting room settled with its familiar sound, a soft shift of weight, a faint hiss. The kitchen table held the housekeeping notebook, open to the current week. The afternoon light came through the net curtains, filtered and slightly yellowed, the same quality of light that had fallen across the same table in 1962 and 1965 and 1968, and now in 1971. The law had changed, the light had not. The carbon copy of the resignation letter was still in the drawer, beneath the housekeeping notebooks and the marriage certificate, and the television rental agreement that bore the name of her husband. She opened the drawer sometimes, not often, but she knew where the letter was, and she knew what it represented. It was the record of the day she had stopped being one thing and started being another. The day the teacher became the wife, the earner became the manager, the professional became the domestic. The carbon copy was slightly faded now, the blue, black ink softer than it had been in 1962, the edges of the paper beginning to curl, but the words were still legible. The gratitude expressed for years of service, the acknowledgement of the marriage gratuity, the careful, formal language of a system that had processed her departure with the same efficiency it brought to ordering textbooks and scheduling examinations. She had been filed, and the filing had determined the next decade of her life. But there was another document now, a divorce petition perhaps, or a job application, or a form for opening a bank account in her own name, without a signature, without a guarantor, without the permission of anyone else. And this document bore a different signature. It bore only her name. The pen in her hand was the same pen she used for the housekeeping notebook, a ballpoint, practical, unremarkable. But the act of signing was different. It was not a record of compliance. It was a statement of intent. The woman who signed it was not doing what the system expected. She was doing what she had decided on her own authority to do. The resignation letter, typed on cream paper with its carbon copy beneath it, had been written by a woman who was doing what the law expected of her. It was a reasonable document, produced by a reasonable person, in compliance with a set of rules that she had not written and had not been asked about. And the filing of it, the handing of a single page across a desk on a January morning in 1962, had been the mechanism by which the rules of the decade were enforced. One woman at a time, in staff rooms and offices and government departments across a country that had given her the vote 40 years earlier and had not yet decided what else she was allowed to do with it. They were not relics of a simpler time. They were women who balanced household budgets in pencil, who stretched meat through 4 days of the week, who relayed coal fires before dawn in houses where the bedroom windows frosted on the inside. They managed the economic unit of the family with a precision that would have been recognized as expertise in any other setting. They navigated a legal system that required them to prove a crime in order to leave a marriage, to secure a male signature in order to open a bank account, and to carry a child to term unless they could afford the price of a private doctor. They did this not because they lacked the intelligence to see what was being done to them, but because the language for describing it and the law for addressing it arrived late. They lived in the gap between recognition and remedy, and the gap was measured in decades. The women who came after them, the daughters, the granddaughters, the women who grew up in a world where equal pay was law and marital rape was a crime, and a bank account required no signature but their own, inherited the rights that this generation had paid for. They inherited the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act and the Guardianship Act and the Domestic Violence Act and the overturning of the Hale Doctrine. They inherited these things as settled facts, as features of the world they were born into, as obvious and unremarkable as the central heating that had replaced the coal fires and the washing machines that had replaced the mangle. They did not know, in most cases, that these rights had been purchased with the pension gaps and the credit gaps and the employment gaps and the silent endurance of a generation of women who had been told to resign when they married and had done so because there was no language yet for refusing. And so, as we look back upon this decade, we are left with a quiet understanding of what it cost to live within its demands, and what it meant to endure them. The cost was specific. It was measured in pension gaps and credit records that did not exist, and careers that ended on a Tuesday morning with a carbon copy and a handshake. It was measured in hotel registers and inquiry agents, and perjured testimony in open court. It was measured in the distance between the afternoon light through the net curtains and the world that existed on the other side of them. And it was paid, as it always is, by the people who had the least power to refuse.